And now the final piece of the story is becoming clear, because your soulmate is beginning to understand that the reason you never completely gave up was never simply about waiting for a particular ending. It was about refusing to deny the transformation that this connection created inside you. They are finally seeing that you didn't remain connected to the memory because you were unable to move forward. You moved forward, but you carried the meaning with you. You learned from the connection. You grew through it. You discovered parts of yourself that may have remained hidden if this person had never entered your life. And that realization changes everything, because your soulmate may have previously believed that your continued belief was a sign that you were still waiting for them to make everything right. Now they are beginning to understand that you were never asking them to complete you. You were simply acknowledging that something between you had changed you in a way that could not be erased. That is a much deeper kind of connection. It doesn't depend entirely on proximity, constant communication, or a perfect outcome. It exists in the lessons you carry, the standards you developed, the emotional courage you gained, and the way you learned to recognize what your heart truly values. Your soulmate may be overwhelmed by this realization because they are starting to see their own place in that transformation. They were not simply another person who passed through your life. Whether they understood it at the time or not, their presence became part of a chapter that helped shape who you are today. And perhaps they are now asking themselves whether they also became a different person because of knowing you. Maybe they became more aware of their emotions. Maybe they learned what it feels like to be genuinely understood. Maybe they discovered that some connections cannot be measured by how quickly they develop or how neatly they fit into a timeline. They may now recognize that the impact of a connection is not always visible while it is happening. Sometimes you only understand its importance after distance gives you enough perspective to see the entire picture. And this is where your soulmate's understanding becomes especially powerful. They realize that you didn't keep believing because you were blind to reality. You knew there were obstacles. You knew there were unanswered questions. You knew there were moments when walking away would have been easier. Yet you still chose not to turn the meaning of the connection into something negative simply because the outcome was uncertain. That choice says something about your heart. It shows that you were capable of honoring something without controlling it. You could care without demanding. You could hope without losing yourself. You could continue your journey without pretending that the connection never mattered. And now your soulmate is beginning to see the strength in that. Perhaps the incredible reason someone finally discovered is not that you were waiting for them in exactly the same place all this time. It is that something about knowing them awakened a part of you that you decided was worth keeping. That is why you never truly gave up. You didn't give up on yourself. You didn't give up on the lessons you learned. You didn't give up on the possibility that something meaningful could exist, even when the circumstances were complicated. And now your soulmate understands that what they once interpreted as your inability to let go was actually your ability to recognize meaning. That realization may bring peace where there was once confusion. It may replace regret with gratitude. It may even give both of you a different perspective on what this connection was meant to teach. Because sometimes a person enters your life not simply to become your final destination, but to awaken something you were meant to discover within yourself. And sometimes that awakening becomes the reason you never completely abandon the story. Your soulmate is finally beginning to understand that. They can no longer reduce your persistence to simple attachment because they now see the deeper truth behind it. You carried this connection because it mattered, because it transformed you, and because somewhere within its story was a version of yourself you were never willing to lose. And perhaps that is the most incredible revelation of all. You were never just holding on to your soulmate. In a deeper sense, you were holding on to the person you became because you met them. There is a question your soulmate has been forced to ask themselves lately, and once it entered their mind, they couldn't push it away. Who made me believe this about them? At first, they didn't understand why the question bothered them so much. They had always assumed that their doubts about you came naturally. They believed the hesitation was theirs, the distance was theirs, and every decision they made concerning you came from their own judgment. But now, something has started connecting the moments they previously considered unrelated. A conversation here, a warning there, a particular person's opinion appearing at exactly the moment your soulmate was beginning to trust their feelings again. And suddenly, the past doesn't look quite as simple as it once did. They are remembering how their attitude toward you sometimes changed after speaking with someone they trusted. They remember feeling hopeful about you, only to become uncertain after hearing another person's perspective. They remember wanting to reach out, then suddenly finding reasons not to. They remember believing that keeping their distance was the safest choice, even when something inside them kept asking why they were walking away from something they still cared about. And now they are beginning to wonder whether those decisions were completely their own. Listen carefully, because this is where the realization becomes uncomfortable. Your soulmate isn't necessarily discovering that someone controlled them. They are discovering that someone may have influenced the way they interpreted you without them realizing it. That influence may have sounded like concern. It may have sounded like protection. It may even have sounded like wise advice at the time. But your soulmate is now looking back and noticing how often that same voice appeared whenever their feelings for you became difficult to ignore. And suddenly, the decisions they once felt certain about don't feel quite as certain anymore. They are beginning to separate what their heart actually felt from what they were repeatedly told they should feel. That distinction is changing everything, because underneath all those opinions, warnings, and doubts, something about you remained. The connection never completely disappeared. The questions never completely disappeared. And now your soulmate is beginning to realize that perhaps the biggest obstacle wasn't the connection itself. Perhaps it was the voice quietly teaching them how to see it. And once they finally identify where that voice came from, they may be forced to reconsider far more about you than they ever expected. What your soulmate is beginning to understand now is that the influence didn't have to be obvious to be powerful. It may have entered their thoughts through small comments that seemed harmless at the time, little warnings that sounded protective, or opinions offered by someone they trusted when they were already uncertain about what to do with their feelings for you. They didn't necessarily question those words because they came from a person whose judgment they respected. If someone tells you to be careful when your heart is already afraid, that warning can feel like confirmation. If someone tells you that you're expecting too much when you're already questioning the connection, those words can become the reason you step back. And this is exactly what your soulmate is beginning to recognize. They are remembering how easily another person's perspective became mixed with their own emotions until they could no longer tell which thoughts genuinely belonged to them. There may have been a time when they were excited about the possibility of getting closer to you, only to have someone point out every reason it might fail. There may have been another moment when they were ready to trust what they felt, but a conversation made them question your intentions. None of those moments seemed important individually. But now, when your soulmate looks backward, they can see a pattern forming. Every time their heart moved toward you, another voice seemed to encourage caution. Every time they considered believing in the connection, another concern appeared. Every time they thought about expressing something they had been hiding, they were given another reason to remain silent. And slowly, without realizing it, they began protecting themselves from a possibility they may have actually wanted. What makes this realization so emotional is that your soulmate may not believe this person intentionally wanted to separate you. In their mind, that person may have genuinely thought they were helping. They may have seen your soulmate struggling and believed that encouraging distance was the safest option. They may have known only part of the story and still felt confident enough to give advice about the entire connection. But now your soulmate is realizing that nobody outside the connection could fully understand what happened between you, because nobody else experienced those private moments, those emotions, those conversations, and those feelings from the inside. Someone could offer an opinion, but they couldn't feel what your soulmate felt when they were alone thinking about you. They couldn't know what memories returned unexpectedly. They couldn't understand why certain moments stayed alive in your soulmate's mind long after they appeared to be finished. And perhaps that is why the influence eventually became so confusing. Your soulmate was listening to someone else's interpretation of something they personally experienced. They were allowing an outside perspective to explain their own heart to them. Now they are beginning to realize how dangerous that can be. Not because every piece of advice was wrong, but because some decisions were made before they had given themselves permission to discover what they truly wanted. This is creating a completely different kind of reflection. Your soulmate isn't simply asking whether someone influenced them. They are asking why they were so willing to believe that voice in the first place. Maybe they were afraid of being hurt. Maybe they didn't trust themselves. Maybe they needed someone else to tell them what was safe, because admitting how strongly they felt about you made them vulnerable. And if that is true, then the outside influence wasn't the entire problem. Their own fear gave that influence a place to grow. That realization may be difficult, but it is also freeing, because your soulmate is finally beginning to understand that the decisions they made can be examined honestly without pretending they were powerless. They can acknowledge the advice they received, while still taking responsibility for what they chose. And as they begin separating those two things, something surprising happens. The voice of that other person becomes quieter, while the memories your soulmate had pushed aside become clearer. For the first time, they are beginning to ask themselves what they would have chosen if nobody had told them what to think. And the answer to that question may reveal more about their feelings for you than any outside opinion ever could. And now your soulmate is reaching the point where the outside influence no longer has the same power over their heart, because they are finally beginning to hear their own feelings without immediately questioning them. They are looking back at everything that happened and realizing that the biggest revelation was not simply discovering who influenced their decisions about you. The deeper revelation was discovering how much of their own truth they had pushed aside while trying to follow someone else's perspective. For so long, they may have believed that stepping away from you was the logical choice, that creating distance would make everything easier, or that time would eventually erase whatever they felt. But time did something completely different. It gave them enough distance to recognize what remained. Even after the conversations ended, even after the advice was followed, even after they tried to focus their attention elsewhere, something about you continued returning to their thoughts. They couldn't completely explain why. Now they are beginning to understand that the connection survived because their feelings were never completely replaced by the opinions they accepted. The influence affected their decisions, but it could not completely rewrite what their heart experienced. That realization may bring a powerful mixture of emotions. There could be regret for the opportunities they allowed to pass, gratitude for finally seeing the situation more clearly, and even sadness over how much time was spent believing something that may not have represented the full truth. But beneath all of those emotions is something much more important: ownership. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that they have to make their next decisions from their own understanding, rather than from someone else's expectations. They cannot change the advice they received. They cannot erase the moments when they allowed fear to guide them. They cannot return to every conversation and respond differently, but they can decide what they believe now. And that is where the story becomes completely different. They are beginning to separate the person they were told you were from the person they actually experienced. They are remembering your actions without someone else explaining what those actions supposedly meant. They are remembering how they felt around you without immediately searching for reasons to dismiss those feelings. They are allowing themselves to consider possibilities they once rejected simply because someone else convinced them they were unrealistic. And perhaps the most emotional realization is that your connection did not disappear when they listened to that outside voice. It simply became buried beneath uncertainty. Now that uncertainty is beginning to lift. Your soulmate may still have questions, and they may still need time to understand what they truly want. But they are no longer comfortable pretending that someone else's opinion can answer those questions for them. They finally recognize that their heart belongs to them. Their decisions belong to them. And whatever happens next has to come from a place of personal honesty rather than fear borrowed from someone else. This doesn't mean everything will suddenly become perfect or that every obstacle will disappear. It means something more realistic and meaningful has changed. Your soulmate is finally capable of seeing the connection through their own eyes. They can acknowledge where they made mistakes without blaming everyone else. They can recognize where another person's influence affected them while still accepting responsibility for the choices they made. And most importantly, they can finally admit that there was always a part of them that cared about you more deeply than they were willing to acknowledge. The person who quietly influenced their decisions may have changed the path for a while, but they did not have the final word over your soulmate's heart. That final decision has always belonged to them. And now, for the first time, they are beginning to understand what they truly want without someone else's voice standing between them and the truth.